All right. So I guess I'd like to start by welcoming you all to the Musconetcong Watershed Association's River Talk series. We're a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and improving the Musconetcong watershed and its waters for people and nature. We do this through planning, education, advocacy, and stewardship, which consists of water quality data collection at the foundation, youth and adult education and outreach, environmental restoration, outdoor recreation programming, and policy work supporting and addressing that foundational science. The River Talk series is a way for us to connect with the community to talk about important issues and interesting topics related to the Musconetcong and watersheds in general. This year, we have a series focusing on the Musconetcong River's National Wild and Scenic status, a designation that at least part of the river has had since 2006. And now approximately 2/3 of the river's 42 miles currently has. Our first talk in this series was in January when Paul Kenny of the National Park Service explained what the National Wild and Scenic designation means. In June, we'll have another talk focusing on some of the wildlife that lives in the Musconetcong River and surrounding watershed. But for now, tonight's talk will be focusing on the human geography side of the Musconetcong River watershed and how the layout and other important features of this valley have driven settlement patterns and land usage. We're lucky to have on staff Dr. Alan Hunt to be leading this talk, given both his professional and personal experience related to this topic. Alan R. Hunt, PhD, serves as the NWA's Director of Policy and Grants. This role includes acting as the river administrator for the Musconetcong Wild and Scenic River, while also managing restoration and adaptive reuse for the historic Asbury Mill. Currently, the MWA is developing its first Musconetcong Wild and Scenic River National Park Service brochure, a watershed-wide interpretive plan, and is beginning the interpretive planning and exhibit design phase for the Asbury Mills Interpretive Center. As a native to the watershed and growing up on a third-generation family farm, Alan's perspective on people's interaction with the land and water greatly informs his work, laying a foundation for how and why ecological restoration benefits water quality, wildlife habitat, and recreation. Now, before I hand it over to Alan, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat or wait till the end to unmute and ask your question. After the question and answering time, I'll also be mentioning some upcoming events and share a link to a survey we'd appreciate your time filling out. And just a gentle reminder to stay on mute during the talk. Now, without further ado, Dr. Alan Hunt.
All right. Well, good evening, folks. I'm Alan Hunt. I'm the Director of Policy and Grants at the Musconetcong Watershed Association. Thank you for the introduction there, Craig. And a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight has to deal with what you see in this photograph here. This is the Musconetcong Gorge, and it's a narrow place in the river. It has steep sides, and it's not an easy place to get through. So in this talk about glaciers, mountains, gorges, and mud, and the human geography of the watershed, we're going to be exploring how people wound up settling where they did in the watershed. So as Craig mentioned, our mission is to protect and improve the quality of the Musconetcong watershed and its waters for people and nature. We do this through a couple of ways: planning, education, advocacy, and stewardship. And what that means is that we have a bunch of different activities that we do. So for education, we do in-school environmental education. We have a summer camp, which you can register for right now. We have a junior ranger program, so you can get your junior ranger badge, just like at a national park. We have river talks like these. Our river cleanup has been a long-running activity, and it is coming up April 15th. We also have people volunteer and help out and monitor the water quality in tandem with our professional water quality scientists. We do restoration work like removing dams and stream bank restorations, and we get involved in advocacy too to make sure that our water quality is staying good and getting better. We're also a National Wild and Scenic River. It was a long process to getting designated, but it was designated in 2006. And this is a map showing where we have the 3 designated wild and scenic river segments. And you can also see in the upper left-hand corner where the Musconetcong River is in relation to New Jersey and the Delaware River. We are New Jersey's largest tributary to the Delaware River. And one of the reasons we got this wild scenic designation was that when that part of the Delaware River was going for wild scenic designation, people here in the Musconetcong thought, hey, we've got a great river too. How about we do this for our river? And the way this works out is you need to have outstandingly remarkable values, things that stand out. What makes this river unique out of all the other rivers in the country? And for the Musconetcong, it wound up being that we have good water quality, which all wild and scenic rivers need to have. And it was our archaeological and cultural resources, our historic resources, the recreational resources, including trout fishing, and scenic resources that are the bedrock for this wild and scenic river designation. And so the way this comes about is that we have a number of outstandingly remarkable values coming from the historic districts. We have 9 historic districts and structures. We have a Paleo-Indian site, a number of Native American sites. We get the most stocked fish out of any river in the state. We also have great brook trout habitat, and we have a countless number of threatened and endangered species. And that means we get to work on things with the National Park Service cooperatively to protect these resources. And we do this together with them because there's no federal footprint here. There's no federal land that was acquired. There's no park ranger on the river in a uniform. There's no ranger station. But we have a cooperative agreement with the Park Service to provide information, help protect these resources. And it's more than funding. It's a partnership where we can receive technical assistance. And then we're also able to use some of the branding of the National Park Service, like this brochure draft that we're working on, and hopefully we'll get to print very soon. And as Craig indicated, the themes for our talk are really those that come through in this brochure about on the water, on the land, heritage deep and strong, and working in partnership. And working on this project, it's only natural to wonder, why are there so many of these different resources concentrated in this one small place, in this one small river? And it unearths these questions I've always had from growing up here and from driving through our region about why the landscape looks the way it does, and about where people live, about why the roads are where they are, and what makes this watershed visually distinct from others in the area. So these are some of the questions that I ask all the time when I'm going around here. And the other thing is I like maps and photographs. And to answer these questions, we'll be looking at some maps and photographs, but we're going to have to go back further, and we're going to have to go back in time to answer some of these questions. We have to understand how geography affected history. I had a high school European history teacher who would always say geography is where history happens. And through his lessons, it was clear that rivers, mountains, and oceans have a lot of impact on history. Consider that great rivers connect people, just like mountains divide them. Areas with poorly defined boundaries would be fought over. Islands generally remained at the fringe of things. They were conquered less often than places connected by land. Ideas were transacted more quickly, where more people traveled, and were more slow to reach places that were out of the way. Those same forces of mountains and rivers, of resources and time to travel, would shape the historical and even present-day connections that the Musconetcong River has to the greater world. So first, we're going to explore how the landscape came to be. This little mini lesson in geography is going to help us answer the main question of today's talk. How did the landscape influence where people live? So we got to go back. And it's hard to believe, but where the rivers flowed was much different millions of years ago. 10 million years ago, there was no Delaware River, but there were several small rivers draining from the northwest to the southeast into the Atlantic Ocean. These ancient river paths carved out gaps in the hard granite ridges of the highlands. And in a landscape of hills running northeast and southwest, those gaps would become the very few places where it's easy for mountain crossings to go north and south. The gaps are used by Native Americans, notably as part of the Minisink Trail, and later by surveyors and settlers as they moved westward. And later on, the mountain gaps were used to provide passage for roads, the Morris Canal, and railroads. So going a little bit closer in time now to us, only 8 to 2 million years ago, those ancient rivers carved out the softer limestone bedrock. And they switched paths, and they generally follow the course of the river valleys we're familiar today, going from the northeast to the southwest. And this is when the Delaware River developed, and rivers like the Musconetcong emerged, making their way down to the Atlantic via the Delaware. But the landscape was really much tamer back then. Around 10 million years ago, what you see as the top of the mountains were these plateaus. They weren't really very high above the lowlands. The river bottom was only about 100 feet lower than the highest elevations in the headwaters of the watershed. This is maybe where the river line would have been. So I'm looking right at the front, like off this top mountain here. And present day, we're much lower down here. So that's what was going on 8 to 2 million years ago. A lot of this area was starting to get carved out as that softer limestone wore away. Well, about 2 million years ago, there was a cold phase, and Arctic conditions expanded, and deep glaciers covered all of Alaska, Canada, and much of northern United States. Northern New Jersey was transformed into a barren, cold, frozen landscape. The rivers froze solid. And over a period of about 1.5 million years, the edge of this so-called Illinois ice sheet moved back and forth, about 10 times. And that line of glacial moving back and forth across the landscape, it was like a giant scrub brush, carving out the river into valleys, into wide U shapes. All that debris from scrubbing back and forth got flushed down into the Musconetcong Valley. And at the end of that Illinois Ice Age, the U-shaped valley filled up with all this sediment from the glaciers, what the glaciers had left behind. And as the glaciers diminished each year, so too did the seasonal floodwaters decrease each year. And terraces of debris hung up on the river's floodplains, a high water mark of each of those floods. And these terraces, like here where the arrow's pointing, would provide close proximity for water and fish, but it would be outside the immediate flooding zone. So this is where we see a lot of our Native American settlements and also a lot of the older farmhouses along the river. But the glaciers weren't done yet. About 21,000 years ago, Arctic conditions returned, but just a little further north of the Illinois ice sheet. And if you want to put it in context, the edge of the polar ice cap was right in the middle of New Jersey. And that was called the Wisconsin Ice Age. So when people are talking about, when the glaciers were here last and things like woolly mammoths, they're really talking about this time period. And it hung on till about 17,000 to about 15,000 years ago, and much longer in northern New York and New England. And this Wisconsin glacier only covered the northern part of the state. And you can see its handiwork in narrow valleys and long, thin lakes and great bogs like those in Great Meadows. That would be these areas that you would see in red. But personally, I find this map just a little too dry for me. On this map, you can actually see the water. And runoff from the Wisconsin Glacier's meltwater is what gave us Lake Hopatcong, and it's what gave us the longest headwater stream we have, Lover's Run. And that landscape was carved by erosion and would later become a pathway to traverse the lands and later be used by the Morris Canal coming across this way and to use the railroads. But to be honest, this map leaves me feeling a little bit flat. This one provides some relief. It goes 3D. And all that glacial meltwater you can see being carried with the debris of broken bedrock, cobbles, silt, and fine clay would have been going down through the valley. And the glacial debris that were left behind, the hills, they're called moraines, and they formed the plateaus that are in the upper watershed. So, for example, if you're driving along Willow Grove Street north of Hackettstown, near the hospital, you're driving on a wide, flat moraine top until you reach Stevens State Park. That's why that area is a little bit higher and a little bit flatter than everywhere around it. But I'll tell you, even this map with that relief it's giving me is still a little too black and white for my taste. Here you go. So this landscape transitioned from about a 2,000-foot deep glacier, like up here in the top, to a glacier in retreat about 17,000 years ago, to a barren landscape. It was constantly in motion. It was cold and windy, and it wasn't hospitable at all. But things began to change. This valley landscape still would have been cold and harsh. If you'd walked it, you'd hear small stones crunching beneath your feet. The river channel wouldn't have settled in place yet. If you tried to cross it, there wasn't a single river crossing to make, but multiple crossings, as the river was still in a braided channel and is still pushing stones further downstream. The only plants that could colonize this minimally soil and rocks would have been lichens and moss. You would have heard a nearly constantly blowing wind with no shelter or windbreaks. It wasn't even tundra, but more like the top of our region's highest peaks, like Mount Washington in New Hampshire. Now, if you were standing on the north end of Schooley's Mountain looking up across the valley, you might have seen the confluence of Lake Apacon's outflow and Lubber's Run merging into a sinuous river delta with glacial moraines downstream, like this one. You might have even seen an Arctic tundra landscape of grasses and maybe some low shrubs or stunted trees beginning to colonize the landscape. And as time passed, an alpine forest began to take hold, like up here. Quite literally, the roots of the plants and trees slowed down erosion as they carpeted the slopes and the riverbanks. The trees and the shrubs broke the wind, and they provided food. Animals and the birds of the day would have colonized this landscape, including the megafauna of the Ice Age. And it was around this time that humans may have begun to explore this frosty fringe of a barely hospitable land. An image like this might have been what parts of the Musconetcong Valley looked like when humans first arrived. Eventually, the landscape became a dense spruce fir forest. No longer was it a foreboding landscape of ice, wind, and stone. It would have looked something like a subalpine forest or the coastal forest that you would see today in Labrador, Canada. It was a cool and damp, dark landscape. Sometime in this transition from alpine forest to spruce fir forest, not less than 1,000 years after the glacier retreated, humans established the first known settlements on the river terraces formed by the glacial moraines or that glacial outwash. And that was about 13,000 years ago. So let's recap our mini geography lesson. There were ancient rivers going in a different direction from today that carved the mountain gaps that we go through today. Slightly less ancient rivers formed, generally following the river channels we see today, like the Delaware and the Musconetcong. Glaciers came not once, but twice, and like scrub brushes, they carved out valleys and lakes that we see today. As the glacier from the last ice age melted, the landscape changed. It was cold, wet, and windy, and there was nothing to eat. And then plants and trees arrived. Big animals ate the plants, and humans arrived following the animals. That's the end of our geography lesson. And now we get to talk about the human geography. Because for more than 10,000 years, that's the way things were, like this. The fish had recolonized the rivers from the seas. Nut-bearing hardwood trees took over and were used for food and shelter. There were no longer any large megafauna like giant beavers, and the mammals we have today were a game food source. And Native American villages expanded in number. There was trade along the eastern seaboard, and items from the coastal plain were traded inland through routes using the rivers and the gaps. And the people known as the Munsee found their home here, as did the Unami to the east and south, and the Mohicans to the north. And this is when the plunge site was first occupied near Asbury. And eventually, Europeans found their way here. And colonization proceeded along where it was easiest. At first, this was the coastal and riverine areas, which were accessible by boat. And for New Jersey, Europeans colonized from two directions, the west out of New York Harbor and the south up from the Delaware. The early colonial history of northwestern New Jersey is tied in with Philadelphia because the Delaware River was easier to use for transportation. The agreement that William Penn made with Lenape, called the Treaty of Shackamaxon, or also called the Penn Treaty, was what was made in now Fishtown, in the neighborhood in Philadelphia in 1682. It's the first treaty, and this is the wampum battle, or the signatory document for that treaty. And the treaty paved the way for explorers and traders to progress up the Delaware River Valley. Boat travel on the Delaware River, though, was limited by rapids along the fall line at present-day Trenton. And Trenton was a key location where trade by land and river intersected and was occupied by colonists as early as 1685. So if we take a look at the map here, the area that's settled mostly along the Delaware shore here, this is all around 1685 up to Trenton, which was about here. And settlement began further out from there. So this is 1695, 1705 in these crosshatches, 1715 here, in the diagonal 1725. And by the time you're up to the Musconetcong, you're looking at about 1735. Just to explain the map here a little bit. You can see the area around New York was settled pretty early, 1665, as well as pockets along the lower part of the Delaware River too. So even when these explorers and traders were heading north up the Delaware River, they really only went so far inland. It doesn't appear that Europeans proceeded up the Musconetcong River past the Musconetcong Gorge. And the gorge itself, it's steep-sided and it has two cascading brooks in it. It wouldn't have had a lot of flat land in there. South of the gorge, the Musconetcong Valley is relatively narrow, about a mile or a little more, with very little flat land. Combined, those factors were not very enticing for settlers, as flatter, more open lands existed further up the Delaware River. This is the location of the gorge. For the Europeans, most of northwestern New Jersey was beyond the frontier, and it was literally uncharted territory, as shown in this map from 1706. There was just a small outlet of the Musconetcong River to the west that appears to have been mapped. By comparison, you can see the detailed knowledge of the Raritan River Basin, with easier access to navigable waters to the east. But this frontier was a peopled landscape. Native Americans had settled in this area too, just south of Trenton, at the Abbott Farm site. For them, that was an important trade location as well, for the same reasons, because it was where land and water trade would intersect. To the settlers, all the indigenous people they found along the Delaware River were Delaware Indians, or Lenape. Lenape was an Unami term from the Native Americans who lived in the Philadelphia region. And as the Europeans made their way up the Delaware River, they called the several other tribes they encountered Delaware or Lenape. For the Munsee, this northwestern New Jersey area was a refuge, a place behind the mountains. It was a place for people displaced from settlers coming from the east and the south. It was a place to hunker down behind the Watchung Mountains that looked toward New York and the rugged escarpments along the Delaware River. They also settled down because of food. There was less game as Europeans began to hunt it out. but there were still fish and the soil was fertile. The Munsee took on a more settled and agrarian lifestyle to produce the food they needed to survive. When the first known European surveyors made their way west to map and claim land, they found villages that they called Indian plantations. The surveyors would note these village sites as signs of fertile soils, and they noted good sites to build dams. These features would enhance the value of the land as they sold it. When surveyor John Redding proceeded down from Lake Apacon to nowadays Hampton, he noted 3 Lenape villages. One village was near present-day Halsey's Island in Lake Apacon. Another, near present-day Waterloo, was an abandoned wigwam where he camped. The third was Peloisi, a farming village near present-day Hampton. Redding wanted to survey more land south of Peloisi, but he was turned away. The paths the colonists often followed were the same routes used by Native Americans because those routes made the easier mountain crossings. The paths that John Redding followed, the so-called Indian trails, were said, or he called them blind paths. But he was riding up on his horse, so maybe he encountered more brush than maybe down below someone walking. They were narrow and they were for single file travel. Most of the time, he couldn't find his way. Those branches, while he was riding his horse, were tearing at his clothes, and he needed the help of a Lenape guide to make his way through. Here you can see the Menacing Trail we mentioned before, using one of the gaps around Glen Gardner to pass into the Musconetcong. So when John Redding made his way through the Musconetcong Valley in 1715, he noted a few other things in his journal that stood out to me. The wigwam in the Waterloo area appeared abandoned, indicating that there had been population decline or outmigration. There was an area called Barrens that caught his attention. It was a wide grasslands with scrub brush emerging, and it's likely what the area that we see as the agricultural area in the central part of the Musconetcong Valley. To be kept open from forest, that landscape was likely actively managed by fire. The village of Peloisi had active agricultural fields. And like he described those trails as being blind and very brushy. He was riding on top of a horse. So those trails probably weren't as dense as he really thought they were. So Redding was using a network of paths to travel to a landscape that was peopled. It was actively managed, and it had already changed from about 100 years of colonization. It wasn't a passively managed landscape of hunter-gatherers. It was a peopled landscape and actively managed when the Europeans arrived. Whoa. All right. So John Redding didn't continue any further down toward the Delaware, and he returned back via the gap at Glen Gardner to Peapack. And he carried with him the information he needed to settle the landscape, maps to divide and sell the land, and notes about natural resources needed to assign value to the land. And Europeans would access the lower Musconetcong Valley by the Delaware River, overland using the same gaps that John Redding did around the 1740s, and then later on using the New Brunswick Easton Turnpike or the Trenton Easton Turnpike by the 1750s. Those two turnpikes joined together in present-day Bloomsbury. Now, let me dissuade you from thinking that a turnpike was a major advancement in transportation technology. That name turnpike came from the gate that would go across the entrance where a fee was collected. It was a cleared path, wide enough for horse travel, and eventually wide enough for a wagon. The surface was unimproved. It was bumpy and dusty when dry and muddy when wet. This image from North Carolina of a much later era more accurately represents the challenges of overland transportation in the 1700s. It's a far cry from today's modern turnpikes. And so, through the rivers and the gaps and the roads and the turnpikes, the cultural settlement patterns of Northwest New Jersey started to play out. And you could see in the buildings and some of the cultural aspects, just how far specific groups of people made it inland with the type of transportation that was available in the day and age when they were immigrating. From the south of the Musconetcong, the influences were mostly English as Quakers moved north along the Delaware River. So if you're looking on this map, uh, E would be Quaker settlements, and P would be as well, that you'd have people coming up from Pennsylvania settling in New Jersey. East of the Musconetcong, it was a more heterogeneous mix, a mix of English, Scots, Irish, and Germans. So you'll see east of the Musconetcong, like in this part of Hunterdon County, it's noted as a more heterogeneous area. And that would have been more influenced by settlement from New York. And we don't have a lot of remaining examples in the watershed of early homesteads. But this little homestead in Seagulltown from 1793, and it's between Riegelsville and Finesville along the Musconetcong River, is the best example. And it's about 2 miles upstream from Riegelsville. Well, this home and farmstead were constructed in the late 1700s, about 1780. It was constructed using the same vernacular fashion as the log homes and barns that were constructed in the 1600s and 1700s. It survives because it was built much later than those earlier settlers' cabins, ones of which we have no records of. And this is one of 2 surviving log cabin homes in New Jersey. Homesteads in the time would have looked like this too. While there were no log structures that survived from the early 1700s, the cultural connections to Philadelphia are still evidenced in the building style. The style of a 2-story masonry house over here, with the 2 upper windows on the ends, is called an I type. It's called an I house because the interior of the floor plan has a central hallway, and with a stairway in it. And then there's rooms on both sides connected to the hallway. The rooms are the hat and the foot of the I, and the central hall is the I's stem. And in these houses throughout the Musconetcong Valley and the region, it wound up being a very popular style that was copied much later on in later structures. So by 1756, with the creation of those 2 turnpikes, the New Brunswick Easton one and the Trenton Easton one, there was still little to draw on the map in terms of settlements. You can see here one of the turnpikes and the other one here, but nothing really in between where the Musconetcong's going except for Changewater. As Europeans moved inland to farm, cut timber, and mine iron, forges were built along fast-moving rivers like the Musconetcong, and small forges developed, usually using locally mined ore and the charcoal from the forest to melt the ore and water power to turn great bellows. The forges of the era were at Chelsea's Forge near Seagulltown, which would have been down here, or present-day Finesville, Changewater, which is on the map, and Squire's Forge, which is close to Penwell, a little further upstream. But in 1756, New Jersey was still a frontier state. The Lenape might have sold or ceded their land as their numbers diminished, but up until 1756, the French and Indian War, or the 7-Year War between England and France, they were coexisting in some fashion alongside the colonists. There were border forts constructed between northern New Jersey and Pennsylvania, from Belvedere up to Port Jervis. And because places north and west of here were on the maps, didn't mean Europeans had control of all these lands. For the British, the Native American land rights were extinguished in New Jersey with the 1758 Treaty of Easton. But the British sought to establish peace with several tribes, and they proposed to limit the westward colonial expansion west of the Allegheny Mountains in return for peace, called a Line of Proclamation of 1763. In this treaty of 1758, the Lenape retained fishing and hunting rights in New Jersey. But this began a long history of displacement, and the westward movement for the Lenape, the Munsee, the Mohicans and wound up displacing them to Oklahoma, to Wisconsin, and north to Canada. But some remain today, and they're still here today too. So up until about the 1750s, we're going to talk a little bit about the economy here. The economy was mostly based on the natural landscape. The climate, the topography, the plants, the animals, the fish were the dominant factors affecting where people lived and how they lived. And so we've looked at those factors in this talk at a broad landscape level of northern New Jersey and the Musconetcong watershed. So we can see that, south of the Musconetcong Gorge, the main products that were being produced were timber, lumber, and paper. They were transported by boat and they were heading to Philadelphia. And then we still have some vestiges of that paper industry too, with the defunct paper mill that's at Warren Glen and the still active Georgia Pacific facility that's on the Warren Glen Milford Road just outside the watershed in Holland Township. North of the gorge, you see some later economic activity taking place. Metals, you see more farming, you see more milling, and most of the transport to market here was overland, and the trade was with New York, New Brunswick, and Easton using those roads. So you've got this demarcation in the watershed about what type of industrial activities happened where because of when those activities developed, what resources were available, and what transportation routes were available. In the later half of the 18th century, other factors came to dominate aside from just the natural resources. The landscape's now been repeopled with European colonists. Some were second generation, and the population was growing. And they needed more metal, more food, more housing materials. And the Industrial Revolution was bringing on new technology, labor-saving technologies, things like an automatic mill design, which would let a grist mill be run with very few people using gravity-powered waterfalls, from dams and using water wheels. And primarily, they would have served the local population because trade was so difficult over land. The Musconetcong itself is not a navigable river. It's too fast, it's too shallow, and too rocky to use boats. So it really didn't make sense to cart any materials through the Musconetcong Gorge. South of the gorge, you see the river trade being the primary force for economic development. But north of the gorge, things really became different, more tied in to the roads and some of these other industries. Well, before the mid 1700s, the geography was that main driver of where and how humans lived. But in the later half of the century, transportation and industrialization were the factors that really drove change. And they were complex trends and they affected places differently. So we're going to focus on one site, the village of Asbury, and principally its mills, to illustrate how transportation and industry affected the landscape. So not much later than after the French and Indian War, the American Revolution took hold. And to the east of the Musconetcong Mountains, much of New Jersey was a battleground. It wasn't really a great place to put a lot of investment into industry if somebody could capture it or toss you in prison or take, something that you had built up and capture it. The mountains did offer some distance from the front, and Adam Hall took an interest in land along the Musconetcong River to develop a mill. Around 1781 to 1783, the original mill, about here, Hall's mill, was likely constructed to mill wheat and rye. And by 1787, that mill was advertised for lease, including an adjacent commodious health. So you see the industry being tied into the prosperity of the landowners, the mill owners, but also the communities as well. In 1792, the mill in Miller's House was purchased by the retired Revolutionary War Colonel William McCulloch. And McCulloch was a prominent landowner, and he also became a rather successful miller. And he came to also adopt the Methodist religion after Bishop John Asbury of England began to expand the religion's presence in North America. It was in honor of Bishop Asbury that the village gained its name Asbury. And if you think about this, if you're bringing a new faith into an area, wouldn't it be awfully strategic to have maybe the most prominent individual in a town convert to that faith and maybe have them help pay for that new church. So Asbury was pretty smart about how he did his work in expanding Methodism. And Colonel McCulloch, who had fought the British in the Revolution, then adopted a religion that came from Britain. So, in addition to this first mill, Hall's Mill, McCulloch purchased two mills on the Hunterdon County side of the river, including a sawmill. And there were a total of three mill seats, or three principal mill locations with turbines or water wheels. The seats meant as the location where the mill race and that water wheel is located. But in a mill building, there could be multiple milling processes happening at once. So by 1831, there were a total of three mills in operation in Asbury, but there were six milling processes at work. McCulloch had developed a second grist mill, a plaster mill, a linseed oil mill, and a clover mill. One of the mills he had purchased, he had sold, and a woolen mill was erected. And the first grist mill still remained processing grain. McCulloch was also a freeholder, so a county commissioner, a legislator in the state assembly, and a judge for Sussex County. So you can see that with his own wealth, he reinvested in his business, and he also took on key roles in the society at the time. And by then, Asbury had grown into a prosperous milling center. By 1810, it boasted a number of large homes and a school, a minister, two taverns, a store, a post office, two doctors, a hatter, a tailor, and a cabinet maker. So those were all some rather refined trades at the time. But Asbury wound up being bypassed when the region's most significant transportation improvement in 1831 opened. It was the Morris Canal. The canal spanned 102 miles, traveling between Jersey City and Phillipsburg. And it took 5 days to go one way. Each canal boat could haul 70 tons of products, everything from coal to iron ore to grain and apple. This volume was a significant upgrade from moving barrels by horse-drawn wagon, and it really facilitated trade with inland towns or ports. These are places where there's names like Port Colden, Port Murray, and Rockport. The canal worked by using a gravity-powered lift and pump system to move boats over a 900-foot mountain with a total of 1,674 feet of elevation change, all by using gravity of water. To do that, the canal tapped a high elevation source of water at Lake Apacon, and that provided the lift needed for the down gradient drainage to fill the canal. And 23 locks lifted the boats and lowered them to get across the highlands in New Jersey. The canal was responsible for the growth of towns like Hackettstown and Washington Borough, and for the development of industry along its route. Now, Asbury wasn't located on the major turnpikes, nor was it on the Morris Canal, but it continued to grow, anchored by the growth of its mills. By the middle 1800s, it had added two more merchants, several blacksmiths, a butcher, a silversmith, and a jeweler, and one or two lawyers and a clergyman. So again, you can see that there's some more fine trades in Asbury, like a silversmith and jeweler. By the 1830s and 40s, several large houses of various revival styles were built, including this house with its Italianate facade for the village's wealthiest resident. The 1850s brought the railroads west. Like before with the surveyors and the turnpikes and the canal, the routes utilized natural gaps. Here you can see the Central Railroad of New Jersey using the gap by Glen Gardner and New Hampton, right here. And as the railroad surveyors identified these routes, there was a land race to acquire and develop parcels, just like you might see depicted in a Western movie. But it happened here much earlier in before 1850. By 1855, Asbury had a railroad station on the central New Jersey line between Hoboken, Allentown, and the coal-producing regions in northeastern Pennsylvania, and that was the Asbury-Ludlow station, about a half mile from the village center. And just like the Morris Canal, these early railroads applied new technologies across the mountains. For example, long trestles like in High Bridge and record-setting tunnel lengths. Here at Changewater, you can get a sense of the river down below, the railroads, and the riverside settlements. Another railroad expanded into the area, the Lehigh Valley Railroad. It had across the Musconetcong Mountain, but the Glen Gardner Gap was already occupied by its competitor, the Central Railroad of New Jersey. The Lehigh Valley Railroad needed a new route to cross the mountains. And when it opened, it needed to use tunnels. And when it opened in 1873, the West Portal Tunnel that you see here was 3/4 of a mile long and was one of the longest in the world and the longest in the eastern United States. Modern American blasting techniques were first developed and deployed in the boring of this tunnel and then replicated elsewhere later. A small village like Asbury, a small village just east of Asbury, about 2 miles away, developed, and it took the name West Portal in its opening. And it seems that the early years of the railroad probably benefited Asbury. You can see the construction of the new grist mill here on top of Hoffman's old grist mill in around 1865. You can see his other grist mill over here. And by this time, when the photo was taken in 1906, some of the other mills had been removed. But this mill still stands today in Asbury, and it was constructed, we're saying circa 1865 because it looks like it was started in 1863, but the capstone is dated 1867. It's likely the Civil War was a good time to be selling flour, but probably a bad time to find labor to complete the mill. But by the early 1870s, this mill, called Hoffman's Mill, had been surpassed. By the 1870s, it had surpassed the earlier mill that was on the site before. Around this time in the 1870s, a wealthy newspaper man by the name of Thomas McElrath, then the publisher of the nationally significant New York Tribune, made his summer residence in Asbury between 1868 and 1882. So the railroad wasn't just supporting industry, it also brought in different people who might be vacationing, and of different wealth and status, maybe than the people who were living in the town. Here you can see the capstone, and dated 1867. So that's why we think it took a little bit of a time to complete the mill. So the mill itself operated entirely by gravity. The building that we see there in Asbury was just a shell for a giant 6-story machine. It was based upon a design called the automatic mill that Oliver Evans had developed and popularized in the 1780s. The novelty of this design was that it was one continuous process for doing all the milling. Product would come in from outside up a gravity operated elevator. Things would go in at the top, and hoppers would go down and get milled, come back up and get cleaned, and they would get bagged or put in barrels that then would be brought back out by gravity and then taken out by cart. It only used gravity, and it could be operated by just 1 or 2 people. So while you might think that the mill might have been a large employer at the time, it really wasn't. That mill was a labor-saving device meant to make the production of grain more profitable. But you can see around the 1880s, Asbury's economic fate had changed. A shoe factory that had opened in 1860 in the village closed by 1874. There was a fire in the woolen mill in 1881, and it wasn't rebuilt. It had been operating since the 1830s. That access to market that likely benefited Asbury when the railroads first came in soon became a train just whizzing past Asbury. And then Asbury was just one small village on a vast interconnected network connecting thousands of similar villages across the country. Right, so Asbury's right here. This is the Central Jersey line, and then here's the Lehigh Valley line, and you can see that literally it was one dot in a web of many small dots. This is what Asbury was competing with. Asbury had grown during the early Industrial Revolution, when its products primarily served the growing local population with some trade. The advances of the second or later Industrial Revolution displaced the small agrarian milling villages like Asbury. With the railroads, the West truly had opened up. Goods could flow into the eastern cities from lands in the Midwest. Large rivers with even more power were dammed to serve larger mills, like this Washburn mill in Minnesota on the Mississippi River. New processes in milling technology were pioneered in Minnesota and widely adopted in the 1870s and 1880s across the country. And those advancements made the Oliver Evans automatic mill virtually obsolete. On a small river like the Musconetcong, where the water power varied by the seasons and the water was going up and down, where the land was steep and you couldn't easily expand, a four grinding stone mill just could not compete in a national commodity market. And Hoffman's grist mill stood idle by the mid 1890s. Henry Riddle acquired the Asbury mill, originally by lease, and later purchased it. The story goes that Henry was a young, enterprising person and and acquired a shipment of graphite in the port of Newark. The usual miller wouldn't process it, but Henry thought he could. It was loaded up by train, brought down from the Asbury rail station by wagons, milled or refined, if you use minimal parlance, and sold to the vendor that had originally rejected it. Orders came for Henry to process more graphite. He sought out mines to buy directly from. He traveled by steamship to Sri Lanka and established relationships with mines there, and thus began a burgeoning graphite milling business that soon included the mill across the river. So it started here in this mill, wound up at that mill. This one still processes graphite today. It's now, it went through 4 generations of a family business, and the headquarters is in Asbury still. It's Asbury Carbons, and it's about a quarter of the graphite demand being supplied by that company for industrial lubricants and as a material. With Henry Riddle's success, the graphite mill expanded. It added new side structures. And as you can see in this map from 1909, you can also see the detail in this map that the graphite mill operated day and night, and it had its own dynamo. The village of Asbury grew again, and this growth is reflected in its institutional buildings. Both the church and the school were replaced in 1914 and 1919, from replacing timber frame buildings to masonry structures. And while there were no more grand homes added to Asbury, its housing stock had a modest growth up to about the mid-1920s. When the automobile era began, new roads were built, again using the gap that Glen Gardner was the preferred route, and the highway passing north through the Musconetcong. Here you can actually see Highway 31 being graded and the curve through Hampton being put in. The bridges being installed, but it's not quite completed. This is from about 1930 here. And certain parts of the highway, like some of the bridges, you'll notice were dated 1928 or 1929. But as you'll note, Asbury's being bypassed from the highways again. And as a result, Asbury still has most of its historic buildings. It has its original street layout, and it has distinct boundaries from the nearby towns because it's still surrounded by countryside. And as a consequence, you can see that places farther from transportation, without a reliable or nearby energy source, and without enough flat land to scale up and out with their factories like Asbury, they were literally bypassed. So if we want to sum up what happened around innovation and technology change and how transportation affected where people live and settle, these new technologies disrupted those older communities. And those technologies were canals, railroads, and later highways. They allowed more mass production and they changed production centers from these old milling towns to places that could grow bigger and have more economies of scale. New power sources reduced the need for water power, which wasn't reliable. And you could see that niche marketing, like going from a commodity grain to a niche mineral material like graphite, was a competitive advantage for a small volume producer. Many of these trends still play out today, and where towns develop, which ones succeed and which ones do not. Well, I think you can see that I like maps and photographs, and I hope you like seeing some of the photos and the maps too. So we've been able to answer a lot of these questions, I think, about where and why people live where they do. So we can do a quick pop quiz if anyone wants before we can talk about the future of the watershed. All right, we don't really need to do a quiz. We can keep going. So what's the future behind those mountains? It's often rural areas that have the most abundant natural resources. And oftentimes it's not by choice. As you can see, a few million years of ice ages and erosion made some places more accessible and some more inaccessible for humans. You can also see that economic patterns and changes in technology have a lot to do with the quality of the natural resources, as well as the community's economic opportunities. We're lucky to have such abundant and visible natural and cultural resources. But much of what remains today is because of the mountains and because of the area being bypassed. And as a result, we don't have that heavy industry legacy that polluted water and land. What we do have are historic districts from the 18th and 19th centuries. We do have farm stands. We have wild brook trout because we have pretty good water quality. And those are the resources we have to work with here. With the abandonment of most all the mills along the river, the Musconetcong Watershed Association saw an opportunity to restore water quality by removing them. So far, we've removed 5 dams. 3 of them were former dams to support the paper industry in the lower Musconetcong, like here, the Hughesville Dam, which you can see being lowered, and the river is starting to go back to being more swift moving in a place where the water stood still. And then here, once it was removed, you have a more wild, free-flowing river again. That dam was removed in 2016, and the following year, 2017, a shad came back, and they're still in the river too. So we know that we've opened up some new permanent habitat for those very important migratory fish. We've also restored from all these removals about a mile of the river to be free flowing. And those are places where people now fish and kayak. We also received a donation of land from Asbury Carbons, including 3 old mill buildings, including that old Hoffman mill. So we have that one grist mill there. This is where the River Resource Center is. This was a storehouse. And there was another structure here. And here in this aerial, you can see Colonel McCullough's house. That's the grand commodious house next to the old mill. So we've adaptively reused one of those buildings as the River Resource Center. Originally, it was a commercial bakery for the grist mill. Again, a value-added product was a great way to make more money rather than just selling a commodity grain. And then later, the graphite company uses a storehouse. And now we've adapted it to become office space and a community space. This laboratory building, which was built on the foundation of the old woolen mill, was used by the graphite company as their locker room and a place to test the quality of their graphite samples. Well, now over the winter, we've removed that building and the island now has a new use. It's reconnected back for people who can go down the stairs and fish or just enjoy a nice quiet quarter-acre island in the middle of the river. And we've been restoring that Asbury mill gradually since 1994. We wanted to house an expanded office space for our headquarters, but also a meeting and classroom and exhibit area. And it is in this vision as an interpretive center that we want to showcase the watershed's resources. We want to tell the story of people's changing uses of the land, much like we're doing in this talk here. We want to talk about our role in restoring water quality and establishing new productive uses of the land and water, like recreation and tourism. And our new strategic plan focuses more on engaging with the community and utilizing science to inform water quality improvements in the face of climate change. This year, we'll be working on several projects to support this goal, to broaden awareness of and action in the watershed. And we're in a planning phase for the adaptive reuse of the mill, including the interpretive center, which would be on the ground floor and the basement. And we'll be developing an interpretive plan and the exhibit designs, much of which is informed by the same themes in this talk. As I mentioned in the outset, we're hoping to have our own Wild Scenic River brochure, just like the Lower Delaware does. And we're working with the National Park Service to develop that. And it'll be a great tool for helping people connect with the resource, learn what to see and do, and experience the Musconetcong River. We're also developing an interactive map of all the watershed's recreational and historic sites. And we're linking that online map to physical signs for the Musconetcong National Water Trail, with support from the New Jersey Historic Trust Heritage Tourism Grant Program. We're also working with the Ramapo Land and Culture Foundation on our educational trail, which starts at the River Resource Center, to include the Lenape language on our interpretive and wayfinding signs, and making the existing trail into a full 3.8-mile trail system on both sides of the river. And the goal of all this work is to build awareness that the river is a valuable resource, that there are opportunities for economic growth and a post-industrial future that respects the river and its habitats, and that everyone can help in the river's stewardship. Preserving what we have comes through careful work of private landowners, local governments, and a partnership with the National Park Service. More work still needs to be done. There's more dams to remove, more land to preserve, water quality that needs to be improved and restored, and always a new generation to educate about how to care for these fragile resources. It takes whole communities to work together, like here at the Musconetcong River Management Council, to keep a landscape intact and a river clean. You can learn more about the watershed and the Wild Scenic River designation and a long history of fishing in person at the Lebanon Township Museum for the next 2 months. It's the first dedicated museum exhibit anywhere in the world about the Musconetcong River. And you can also get your national park passport stamped when you visit. And if you're wondering what more can you do to help, you can join us for a hike, learn more about the resources and actions that you can take. You can participate in the river cleanup. We have our annual Run for the River in Asbury coming up. We have a native plant sale coming up too. We also have a petition that you can sign for a campaign called Great Waters New Jersey, where we're trying to keep our water quality clean and making sure our state policies are doing the best they can to do that. You can help with the mill. We also have some great videos that you can share on YouTube, including one about a long-running partnership with farmers on the West Portal Creek, where we were able to restore the creek and reduce the bacteria levels by 97% above the goal that we were expecting. You can help build a trail bridge, and you can donate. We hope that this story about our watershed inspires you and gets you thinking that people have lived here for 13,000 years, and that will only continue to be able to live here through stewarding its water and natural resources. Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share all this with you tonight and your attention, and we hope to see you again at one of our upcoming events. I'm happy to take any questions at this time and appreciate your attention for the past hour during our talk.
Thank you so much, Alan. That was very well said and very detailed. I hope everyone else learned something because I certainly did. But like Alan said, does anyone have any questions? I did post all of the upcoming events that Alan had listed in the chat in case you wanted to take a look at those there. I do have, if you guys have just a minute or two, I had mentioned a quick survey we would really appreciate you all filling out. So I'm going to share that right now. If you can just scan the QR code. There you go. Can you all see that? Hopefully we will be able to, we will be posting the recording on our YouTube and our Facebook. So that will follow. All right. All right. Well, I am going to stop sharing and then I am going to stop